everyone. It's September the 23rd. This is Don Prezant with Badge Clinic, and usual crowd of suspects. But today we're happy to welcome Tailor Kendal to speak to us about the Internet of Education. And he's got some interesting slides, and I look forward to learning what he has to say. Tailor, I'll just hand it across to you.
Great, thanks, Don, and thanks for opening the door and welcoming me to Badge Clinic. Have followed a lot of this work sort of tangentially through other networks for quite a while, but you know, maybe this is a good catalyst to get us plugged in more intentionally. So appreciate the time, and thanks for the reschedule. Absolutely on me. We missed the mark on the last time trying to do this. So thanks for the flexibility. I'm gonna jump right in. I've got a deck that I will probably speak faster through than some might be comfortable with, but that's only to leave as much time around discussion. I'd really rather just sort of lay some context and then have an open discussion. Quick background before we get rolling. I come from a sort of academic background, taught across a number of universities in Denver, Colorado. Still am based in Denver. Did a little bit of work at the state level there for a council that was exploring emerging technology. Then spent a short bit of time at the U.S. Department of Education, supporting, again, their exploration of emerging tech. And then for the last year or so, just over a year, have been working with Learning Economy Foundation as a chief program officer, as well as sort of the director of some of the work we're doing in Colorado specifically. So that's sort of me. That's some of my background. I really like the intersection of where we're going, sort of futurism, as well as just systems level thinking, complexity theory, and sort of bridging that back with some of my background in sort of the traditional system of education. So this big broad idea of the Internet of Education is something we've been pushing and sort of launched and kicked off at Davos last year, and are hopeful to kind of do a reboot in 2021, and have done a lot of good work to I think build some capacity to sort of tell the story in a more cohesive way. So going to give a peek into that story here for everybody. So this is just high-level framing around why I think it's important to start thinking in this way. This is, I've adapted this from Andreas Antonopoulos and some other folks in sort of the Web3 world. They talk about this idea of infrastructure inversion, and looking back historically, there's these interesting patterns that emerge when large infrastructural shifts take place, whether that's transportation, going from the horse to the automobile, whether that's just electrification, moving from sort of physical lines to the Wi-Fi that we know now, or even in sort of financial systems. I think we're seeing a pretty clear shift with the emergence of, you know, whether it's digital currency in China or some of the exploration around things like Bitcoin elsewhere. These are all big infrastructural shifts. And the interesting pattern is that often with all of these shifts, the sort of incumbent infrastructure utilizes or sort of rides on, the infrastructure to come sort of rides on the incumbent infrastructure for often quite a long period of time. You know, horses and automobiles were operating in unison for a number of years. It actually led to a lot of advancements in shocks and struts in early automobiles because they were utilizing rutted out paths that, you know, horses have much better, evolution did a good job of building shock systems into horses, much better than mechanical vehicles. So anyway, often these things sort of ride in parallel, but then at some point a shift happens, and the inversion point actually is often quite quick when that takes place. And so we're at this stage where we're really exploring, you know, the institution from the highest level of education has, you know, been around for quite a while, hundreds of years, and well, thousands, depending on sort of if you look back to, you know, some of the early philosophers. But the system we know has been around quite a while, and I think we are at a point where we're starting to see some shifts in the underlying infrastructure itself. Where that ultimately lands is still, I think, a question we can sort of wrestle with and consider, but sort of helping to fill that question mark is more or less where we find ourselves at Learning Economy. So This is probably fairly familiar to most, but these are some of the big challenges that sort of frame a lot of our work. I think the two to the left are sort of most pressing in current times. Skills gaps, equity gaps. We all know, certainly amid COVID, you know, there's a pretty stark light on how significant some of these problems are, and there are, you know, vast numbers of learners that quite literally do not have any means of connecting to some sort of education. And then there's a lot of human capital investment that is, you know, we see money in the U.S. coming out of the CARES Act, sometimes sort of pushed fairly strategically, but other times more or less a sort of flip of a coin and a hope for the best sort of scenario where there's just not a lot of underlying data to understand exactly what the impact of some of that investment is. And then fragmented data, you know, duplication of effort. I think we're familiar with a lot of these, but this frames up, you know, these are some of the big challenges we're working towards. So, you know, this is sort of a meme and a vision and an idea that we've been sort of helping to propagate that we think can help solve some of those challenges. A sort of single unified system of education that is both decentralized, also localized, but unified. And we have similar means and sort of consistent means of discussing some of these things. Certainly, a lot of the work out of open recognition, and this group has certainly led to helping support some of that idea. So at the root of some of this, we see, again, this is oversimplified and certainly not as linear as it's depicted here, but you know, if we think about sort of the broader project of education, there is a bit of a supply chain, and there are sort of silos that exist across this continuum. And currently, there's quite a bit of fragmentation that that sort of exists between these disparate systems. And we can certainly think about sort of, you know, research that comes out through an institute that gets created or adopted within, you know, within a school or university. That becomes content. Pedagogies and specific strategies are built around that. Teachers teach it within an LMS. Students hopefully learn. They're assessed on that. They move through to jobs. So they're, you know, we like to think of it, you know, there is a supply chain here at work, though this is admittedly simplified. And the sort of mapping between these systems often is only done through legacy web portals, a lot of email. You know, it's amazing the power of email, the open standard that sort of drives the web. Really, in a lot of cases, is just some of the early standards that emerged out of being able to transfer data that way across computers and systems. So, info transfer currently is largely by way of email. Sort of with that framing of you know, having a sort of single sort of supply chain, but often disconnected in some ways. There's been a lot of work around open standards and this idea of sort of new trust networks that can underlie some of these broader systems. And certainly the Trusted Learner Network at ASU has pioneered some of this, but also a ton of work across a number of standards bodies. Certainly, you know, Badger and some of the open badge work, folks here very familiar, much more so than I. But I think there's good momentum around sort of new trust networks. And at the core of building out those trust networks is this sort of idea of this trust triangle. And don't need to go into detail. I know you all are familiar with this. The Trust Over IP Foundation, I think, is a you know, a good signal, and you know, there's good momentum there to help sort of push some of this thinking forward. But obviously a ton of other work going on in this idea of just building trust into base protocols, often within the internet itself, in the case of Trust Over IP, but also within sort of localized trust networks. I'll touch on that a bit, but that's certainly what we're looking at with some of my work in Colorado. And so, you know, with those sort of trust networks baked in a more core sort of, again, foundational level, this is the new infrastructure in many ways. We can start to think about unifying some of these systems that exist between identity, education, and employment. And a lot of, again, I think this is old news to some on this call, because you all have been in this space for quite a while, thinking about new means of recognition. How do we actually signal and transmit value across networks, but done in a way that's that's a little more stable and more mature, and has sort of trust baked in, as opposed to assumptions having to be made whether or not somebody is who they say they are. We like to say, you know, I've had moments on LinkedIn where I get, you know, a friend request from somebody that happens to be the CEO of IBM, and Coke, and like has four other, and we just know that there's, you know, there's much too much gaming of existing systems, and again, to nobody's fault. Game theory is at play whenever humans are involved. So a lot of this work is to leverage new technology to help to you know, support a new infrastructure. One level sort of deeper, and again, absolutely oversimplified, but if we look at sort of that broader chain as more of a sort of just value chain, where is value ultimately being created across this broader continuum, by I guess unifying some of those systems and looking at it as a sort of a singular value chain, we can start to map and understand, you know, where value ultimately is being created and how that transfers through to a learner or a user, and how that ultimately is empowering and can, you know, provide them more opportunity. So again, I know I'm flying through this, but one step further, we can look at, you know, new technology. I am of the opinion that much more valuable to sort of work with the technology that we know is evolving, as opposed to try to push back. And when it makes sense to push back, absolutely. I think there's a lot of interesting ethical considerations when we talk about machine learning and AI, but it's also a bit inevitable. And so our hope is to help be part of the conversation that shapes it in a way that can ultimately benefit humanity and not undermine or destroy it. I have concerns about that right now, and we were just talking about the social dilemma. I think that paints some of the picture of the problem, given sort of the current systems and some of the platforms we operate with. So again, this is all coming together into being able to really understand where value is generated and have true outcomes data across the life cycle. So, you know, you could actually better understand what research actually led through to opportunity and to actual economic advancement. Currently, that'd be a really hard challenge. In fact, it's PhD level work. Carrie knows this. To really deeply understand how these systems are connected and where the value is ultimately being generated, it's a long, arduous process often, and we think there's means of allowing that value to surface through some of this work. And so, again, this is just a snapshot of some of those players that are sort of involved across these various systems. This is by no means holistic, but you know, gives you a sense, and I'm sure folks are familiar with a lot of those represented here. And our sort of interest and vision is to start to think about how can we look at this as one holistic, single internet of education, and as opposed to the sort of siloed systems that we currently, I think, know well and operate within. So this is still very blue sky, still big vision. We'll get to some of the practical work going on. This is just sort of a separate visual. We're working in Florida. Like I said, my work is largely in Colorado, looking at a number of projects and pilots to start to think about some of this stuff. So to get there, to get to this broader vision of the Internet of Education, we see some foundational sort of ecosystem utilities that need to be sort of built out and envisioned. And that allows us to move towards this idea of sort of a GPS ecosystem for skills, careers, and learning itself. And so this is another analogy we use quite a bit, much in the way we have sort of a GPS system currently that allows us to physically navigate to sort of value centers or just to get a good coffee. You know, I think there is interesting work going on that'll allow analogous educational systems to take shape, that allow, you know, me as an individual to own and control the things that I ultimately learn and do, and that can help me and move me and navigate me towards career opportunities and fulfillment in life, whatever that might look like, whether or not that's sort of a traditional path and job or not. So I'm going to breeze through these, but utility one, this is very very clear now that we are not connected the way we ultimately should or could be as a people. And so in order for any of this to happen, we really are helping propagate this idea of we've got to make sure everyone on Earth has access to the sort of information age in some capacity. That doesn't necessarily mean having broadband at home. It could be, you know, having access to a library that has internet and some computers, you know, that can be used, or other devices. So we're a part of this work, but not directly tied in. But we are looking and partnering with some other local sort of providers, groups like Notable, or, you know, some of the mesh network providers that are doing really interesting sort of 5G work in local communities. I think some really interesting work that will hopefully beat us to the. I know there's other broader sort of global and national work to actually build out this infrastructure, but I think there's going to probably be some steps that need to be taken between now and when we actually might get to a sort of single connected people and humanity. Utility 2, this is probably where we find ourselves most squarely focused. That's around this idea of digital wallets, and you know, an individual, a learner, having access and control of the things that they ultimately demonstrate that they know or can do. And again, familiar work to all of you. But I think, you know, SSI and this idea of just owning my stuff. We say that, like, I think that in the most simple terms is really where we're headed. What does it look like for me as an individual to own the things that I should own? And whether that's data broadly or educational, you know, recognition and credentials. So a lot of work going on in that sort of, again, utility skills libraries. This is also happening in a few different exciting areas, but means of curating, whether it's courses or assessments or the things that ultimately allow me to grow towards the career I want. How do we curate that into a meaningful, individualized sort of library? And an obvious example here is, you know, someone that ultimately wants to become a nurse really needs to understand some math, but not all math. They certainly need to understand ratios. That can be life or death. But some of the more complex trigonometry, that might not be as critical, knowing that, you know, ultimately I want to become a medical professional, as an example. So means of curating skills and opportunities. And certainly that's, you know, there are amazing platforms, things like Khan Academy or Duolingo, and there are. This isn't to say this doesn't exist. It's just seeing it as a singular sort of public good utility. This is the idea of just standardizing, and a lot of great work going on here as well. But this idea of a skills USB, much in the way I can transfer information from one machine to another because of the standardization around the USB. What does that look like in education to sort of standardize in if and when it makes sense, skills, knowledge, things that can actually move and allow for more fluidity between opportunities, between institutions. And you know, I think all here are also familiar with some of this work going on in, you know, W3C, IEEE, the Open Skills Network that sort of came out of the T3 Innovation Network and Western Governors University. I think that's a interesting new project that has potential to help sort of bring some of this to maturity. So utility 4, and then utility 5, this is sort of the, you know, as we package all of that together, we can start to think about this idea of a career GPS, where I, as a learner, can sort of map my own pathway through various, again, value centers, whatever that looks like. That might be a traditional path within a university, but it also might be, and is more likely these days, we're seeing it often, a much more circuitous route through, you know, other opportunities, maybe a coding boot camp here, maybe you know, another opportunity at a local community center or a library, and all of that. You know, how do we actually build recognition and allow me to own the things I'm ultimately working towards? And being able to self-direct and sort of retune, I think that's critical. You know, as my interests change, I mean, just as of 6 months ago, I think all of us were probably in a little different space as far as what we ultimately thought we might want to do or achieve or become, and allowing adaptability, you know, for me as a person, but also, you know, the world around us obviously is is ever changing and dynamic. So being able to adapt to those sort of broader global dynamics as well. And that results in, this is the sort of namesake, this idea of a learning economy. This is really where we'd like to move, and the Internet of Education, again, is just sort of a vision and meme that wraps that up. But learning economy, you know, this is an idea that came along with the early web. You know, Berners-Lee and Cerf and others, you know, talked about the knowledge economy and actually thought about some of this early on. But I think we're starting to see new technology and new means of actually getting there, where skills, knowledge, those actually are treated like assets and have currency in a marketplace where, you know, my investment in myself and the learning I ultimately, you know, move through and achieve has some quantifiable value. And right now that really often just comes in the form of a degree. But we've seen, you know, even degrees, I think, are quickly losing their sort of power in the market. So we're quite literally looking to sort of invert, this is the infrastructure inversion, invert the entire model where learning can actually be an act of earning and building equity in myself. And so that is the sort of background, where we'd like to be, and then this is some of the current work going on, and this will be pretty quick, but we have been sort of catalyzing a lot of this by way of these collabs. So this is a project that is still fairly new, but we have been working with the T3 Innovation Network to sort of build out a centralized resource hub where a lot of this thinking can sort of coalesce. And so ler.hub, Learning and Employment Record, is part of this fun acronym game we all play. LER, CLR, ILR, all sort of centering around some of the same core themes. But that's exciting, and it's, I think, going to be an ongoing resource sort of nucleus for a lot of this work and these pilots. Like I said, in Colorado, that's sort of where a lot of my focus is, looking at a number of projects around the digital wallet. We also have a state-issued digital driver's license now, and we have a really fun and interesting opportunity to sort of merge the worlds of education and identity at a state level. Happy to chat on that. Some of the skills library work, we've got a collab across a school district in Florida, the Broward, and that's really looking at a K-12 level, how do we, and their specific focus is sort of math and algebra, but how do we curate these, you know, sort of specific learner-centered skills libraries around algebra specifically, and they just got some added support, so that work and that sort of lab is certainly going to, I think be a good model to look towards. And then working a bit on the sort of algorithm side with a small group out of Google and XLab in Mountain View. And again, this comes back to this interesting interplay of what do the sort of tech giants represent in this game. And I'm of the mindset we've got to find ways to build this infrastructure together where it makes sense, but also be push back where it makes sense. I think it's got to be both. And then have a lab that has been evolving for about a year across the Asia Pacific region and the iSchools network specifically. Excited about that work. There's now, I think, directors at 9 of the 11 iSchools across that region, looking at what does this mean for a broader sort of global network, regional global network, and looking at things like cross-border mobility. So that's in process. This is just a high level on sort of the collab model. These are just sort of incubation spaces and communities that we're helping to support. At the base, unifying that supply chain, guide it with research, a lot of great research going on. This group is certainly doing some of that research, direct it with local work groups, understanding what the local dependencies are, solving with foundational pilots. That's, I think, where a lot of the work is currently, and then just trying to work towards empowering states and nations and building out this new infrastructure, what we like to call 22nd century ready infrastructure. A little more detailed look, but all of these collabs have taken a much different sort of shape than this, but this is just a general idea of how things might evolve over the course of a couple years. to help sort of stand up again some of this, what we see to be the only infrastructure in many ways. We don't have the singular answer, but I think it's fairly clear that something has to change. Something new does need does need to be built around the system of education. Exactly what that looks like, we're I think very open and adaptable. And then this is just a high level on sort of where we've been and where we're headed. Really in phase 2 there with proof statements, really trying to build out some models to say this is why this matters. Certainly want to lean on this crew and others that are doing some of this work. And then really looking at, how do you scale some of these and build out broader systems, and then have some good opportunities, I think, in a few years' time to bring this to a global stage, and really a lot of our sort of North Stars towards those 2 SDGs, quality education and economic opportunity for everybody on Earth. So that's it. Thanks. I know that was probably just a bit more than 20, but hopefully that gives you a taste of just sort of where we sit and some of the work we're doing, and this big grand blue sky idea of a single internet of education. So open to questions, and would love to have a discussion.
That's great, Taylor. I think I sprained my fingers trying to keep up, but just trying to take notes on the Etherpad there. I'm not sure anybody's entered any questions, so what we'll do is we'll take those live. Anybody have any comments or questions?
You know what, Taylor, I'm going to put the website, the new app, in the chat for everyone. It's internetofeducation.org. I think everyone would like to look at that.
It's new enough, it doesn't even hit my radar, but we do have, we'll do some bigger push and some publicity around it, but it's certainly out there and available. So please. Thanks, Carrie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's some core principles there. We would love, anyone that has a strong opinion around what matters when it comes to some of these ideas. There's certainly space there to have a open dialogue. Over the next 6 to 8 months, we'd really like to build as much engagement and discuss these things. So there's some technology we've developed to facilitate some of that discussion. So feel free if and when you have time.
So I have a question, and I think you sort of partly dealt with it a ways down there, and it has to do with this concept of pedagogy, which is, you don't hear it much in North America, but it's a little more popular in Australia. The whole idea of the really self-directed learner, not the self-paced learner, but the self-directed learner, the one who can tune themselves, the one who can balance goals and steps toward those goals, and can dynamically adjust their learning and how they present themselves to the world. In relation to underserved populations. So I think a lot of this stuff is, it's pretty exciting technology, et cetera. What I see is a lot of sort of higher education stuff, some K to 12, but a lot of higher education stuff. So I'm wondering how this would relate to underserved populations and things like, that whole UNESCO, the right to an education, et cetera, the sustainable development.
Yeah. I mean, this, in a lot of ways, is why I'm really excited about some of Carrie's research and others too. I think, and my sense is that finding means of empowering. I mean, I've done some work, and my wife's a high school teacher, and it's pretty remarkable when you throw whether it's refugees or other populations into fairly uncomfortable positions, but relative to some of what they know is possible, or some of their sort of previous reality, they know that things can be better, and that and again, this is a very sort of Western. This is the lens of me in the U.S., but I've seen populations that have so much unrecognized. Again, this is why this is such a great fit with this community. They just feel unempowered and don't have a means of sort of owning and being able to demonstrate the things that they ultimately bring. Often that's sort of softer things like resilience and just good leadership skills and things like this. So my sense is, by empowering any individual within a sort of trust network that allows them, again, to sort of own and feel like they're in control of the path they ultimately want to take, to whatever end that might, that might be. My thought, and I certainly experienced some of this going through, though I did have a fairly like traditional, upbringing and education, and feel, very, I guess, fortunate to have gone through it that way. But there was points where I was like, I don't care about this. How do I like take this and shape it into my thing? And there was no sense of empowerment, because it was either this school or this, and so anyway, the thought is that, what are the broader sort of paradigm shifting, like how do we shift the zeitgeist of our perception on what it means to learn and to evolve and grow? And I think that serves the underserved. And I'm hoping, psychologically, that has much more of an effect on those that don't necessarily come from much or have much. And, those that do, and those that come from more privileged backgrounds. If that doesn't change that population, then that's fine. They were probably going to be okay anyway, and they were probably going to find their way into some decent opportunities anyway. So, yeah, I mean, I think all of this work is centered around, if this doesn't benefit the 80, 90% of humanity that we know probably is in a more difficult position than any of us are, just by way of us being on a Zoom call, then we're probably not doing it right. But yeah, we're leaning on others, obviously, and the research around some of the psychological benefits and some of that sort of thing to help shape the direction.
Yeah, so the UNESCO has this Institute for Lifelong Learning, and actually a couple of weeks from now, we're going to have somebody reporting from a recent report they delivered. And I'm just wondering if there's some good synergy there, because when I was looking at your idea about access, and I think that was utility 2 somewhere in there, you're talking about access to networks, et cetera. And I'm just thinking if there's something that could go in there to be more sort of access to education, access to efficacy, to say that, to build that confidence and to make them want to claim things, make them want to say, I can do this, or I want to do this, and not just, what you say I can do, which kind of relates to our community here.
Yeah, and others, please feel free to jump in, but I think this is one of our concerns is it enough to take the sort of, if you build it, they will come. Right now, that's sort of the mentality. Let's kind of build some new infrastructure. Let's start to, and by doing that, it will change the mindset of those that, and part of this is just a generational shift. Like, I feel like I went through a fairly traditional path and only really knew education to be sort of one thing, both public as a kid, but also through college and into graduate school. But even one generation back, if I ask my parents, like, they're completely separated from this. This doesn't equate at all. So I think we're just like, what seeds do we plant so that, the kids currently that are kind of, and COVID represents this really interesting lens that is, I don't think we give credit to how big of a shift this is. And like, there's a lot of new thinking around this thing we call education right now, because everyone's experiencing it in a way that doesn't map to either their parents or previous generations. And so we're already, I think, reshaping the sort of cultural zeitgeist unintentionally by way of a shitty virus that I'd rather have not been here, but it is. And so, yeah, what are the signals we can plant and the seeds we can plant now to maybe take advantage of the fact that I do think the thinking around what it means to learn and to grow and to, have a fulfilling life actually looks like for people. But there's a lot of open questions around that.
What I thought in the research, what I found was remarkable in the blockchain for education research was the shift in thinking about learning not being so formal. When we were all starting in Open Badges over a decade ago, it was very much about informal learning, and the higher ed and post-secondary institutions were like, oh, that's terrible. You're going to like disrupt our model. And then, a decade later, I'm interviewing, all these institutions, people outside institutions, and they were all like, oh yeah, lifelong learning, things like curriculum launched a few years ago, like 2018. If you're not familiar with that, I can put that in a link in the chat for us. So there has been this shift already, thinking about that. And I feel as though that's because the work has been happening. It's been ongoing. It's progress. It's long progress, but it is happening.
I'm not sure if I agree that they've shifted. I think they've more redefined it for their purposes, you know, so they are saying that, okay, we can do these things, but they're not alternative credentials. They're not informal learning. They need rigor. They need assessment. And, you know, they're coming up with frameworks where they want to make sure there's good quality. You know, that's what I'm picking up in a couple of markets. You know, there's discussions going on LinkedIn right now about we need a framework. We need to know where these things will fit. Are they micro credentials? Are they alternative digital credentials according to IDEC? Are they the EMC credentials that are a minimum of 100 hours of learning before they can be recognized? So what I'm seeing is a certain amount of a self-healing organism and reinvention of what began as a sort of hippie thing, as you know, this is another way of doing what we're doing, except on a micro level. And Sarish has written on this topic in the past. So that's what I'm picking up. And to some extent, they're talking about competencies. Typically, it's about course outcomes rather than competencies. But I'm not seeing what brought me into it, which is recognition of prior learning, recognition of you know, experiential learning. I'm not seeing that so much. I'm still seeing it as very programmatic at the higher education level. Sarish, yeah, you're muted.
Yes, I wrote a question. Because when I'm looking at the instruments you are presenting, they are very much targeted at individual level. You know, the skills of the people, the GPS of the people, and how about organizations and communities? Because if you want to create what you call a learning economy, I prefer the term of learning society to learning economy, because what we aim for is making society together. The economy is just, I could almost say, some kind of a byproduct of society and not the center of society. Although it depends how you refer to economy. Yes, and also the thing that to continue on what Don says is one of the beauties I saw in technology and with badges in particular was to move from what I call the analytical approach of recognition to the analogical approach to recognition. To say, no, you don't. If you want to find a good baker, you don't have to have a checklist of all the skills a baker need to have. You need to see the bread is good, and there are a lot of clients, and you say, I want to have someone like him or like her, and then the baker knows other bakers, and then there is this idea of a community of a community of practice. You know, a community of practice can exist independently from any kind of framework. You don't have to create a competency framework to have a community of practice, and so. I think that what you have done, which can be extremely useful, I don't want to deny the validity of the kind of tools you are thinking of, but I think they are very much based onto an analytical approach and not into an analytical approach. For example, it would be very interesting to say, oh, I would like to become, I don't know, I would like to become an artist, I would like to become an engineer. And you look at one engineer and another engineer, and you will see they will have many different paths to go there. And this is an analogical approach. You start from the individual, the actual path, and not from an analytical approach where you try to describe some of the competencies, because anyhow, you will never be able to describe all the competencies, and probably the ones that are the most useful won't be present in the competency framework.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we disagree. I actually love learning society. we might need to like spin off a secondary operation, because it makes a lot of sense. And I see it as sort of, it's a both and. I mean, absolutely, I think our focus in a lot of ways is empowering individuals. I think this is more to combat what we see as problematic with just the current data economy, and how much, again, it's the cat's out. Like, there are 4 or 5 companies that are absolutely breaking away from the pack, and it's leveraging, individuals' data. So that's where some of the individual piece comes in. But at the same time, there's no disconnection. We are trying to empower individuals to see their connection to both the localized communities and economies. This is where the collabs come in. I mean, all of our work focuses on localized community collabs that ultimately build a shared understanding of where we might be able to go, both as a local network, but then also how that connects as a node to a broader global community or network. So I mean, that's, I think, as much of the mental shift that we're hoping to try to sort of propagate, is that interconnectedness and interdependency, both, and by me seeing how my, I guess, individual capacity or potential on a very local, small level, even within a single neighborhood, how that could ultimately map towards affecting the broader good. I think that comes through by me, I guess, being empowered and owning my skills, my data, my credentials. And at the end, like, even if none of that quite works, and all we do is find a way to get out from under the sort of the debt sentence that so many students, at least in the US, are experiencing, that in itself it might be the singular goal. Like, we just have a big problem with the cost of education, and it's not paying off for many. In fact, that's what started me down this path. Was I went through the entire accreditation process at the university I was at, and learned that just over 30% of students were graduating across 6 years at it's a sort of traditional state school, not a huge tuition cost. I think students were probably looking at $25,000 to $40,000 in student debt. But to know that 60+% of those that were taking on that debt were not even, they hadn't, I mean, they had the experience, there is some value there, but they didn't have anything with any sort of currency in the market to show for it. Anyway, that's a tangent, but I don't think we disagree so much, Serge. I think it's absolutely has to be both.
Just one thing that we're working on with several projects is the idea of visualization and making visible. The idea of the badge was precisely to make visible things that were not visible. But for example, when you have a tool called a wallet, the wallet is in my pocket. Nobody sees my wallet. And what I don't see in the range of tools you are developing, something that makes visible the skills of a person within a community, or I don't see it. Maybe it is there, but that's why when I say it is very central on the individual, it is in my pocket. I own, but the question is not just to own, is to activate. And in order to activate, it needs to be visible. And we can't just expect that it is LinkedIn that one day will probably disappear, because there will be a competitor to LinkedIn that will arrive. So how do you see this activation of all these credentials and skills that people have in their wallet?
Yeah, I mean, there are, I think, a number of projects that fall squarely in making visible the skills and knowledge, whether that comes in the form of a badge or other forms of. We've got all sorts of interesting. I've seen some weird, like Web3 blockchain-based projects that Source Cred is one. There's others that are like really taking a very different approach to like community-driven recognition. Anyway, I would say we don't. Our goal really is to help be an amplification mechanism, a community development resource. we're a pretty small, scrappy group that is not, by no means, and I should clarify, we're not building all these things, right? All these utilities. We are working a bit in the wallet space and thinking a lot about just the standards in SSI, but beyond that, like, we have a small piece of technology that we can plug in and utilize if and when it makes sense. But we are trying to find the right voices to and just help, again, move towards whether the internet of education is the right way to frame it or not. I think there's a shared understanding of there is a different future worth pursuing, and I think our sort of hope and interest as a single nonprofit in a ocean of work going on is to just help support and amplify the signals that we think map to that sort of vision, or call it a learning society. If the way you frame that, I think we want to support those that are taking that frame, but usually that doesn't come in the form of us actually building out core sort of front-facing technology or applications.
Thank you.
Well, we've come to the top of the hour, so I think it's probably time to shut this one down, but it has been a really stimulating one. Thanks very much, Tailor, for presenting these ideas and getting such a great discussion going.
Yeah, we've only just begun, so feel free wherever it makes sense. Yeah, we're an open door to have folks plug in and help share the same signal.
Okay, that sounds great. So just to reiterate, in 2 weeks, we're going to be hosting Daniel Baril from Quebec, who's the chair of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. He'll be talking about embracing a culture of lifelong learning and the values around that. I've just been tweeting about that. Maybe what I can do is just to drop a link to the document itself. There's, I think on page 9, there's a sort of set of values. And actually, interestingly, one of them is that learning is holistic. The other one is that learning is collective. So it's picking up on what Serge was just saying. So that'll be, we're looking forward to that one as well. And the synthesis of all these ideas as we continue these badge clinics. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, Tailor. Thanks, everyone. Nice seeing you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
Bye.
Bye.
Yes.